What does a civilization sound like when it begins to disappear? Not with the crash of armies or the thunder of collapsing walls, but with smaller things. A cough in a crowded room, a fever behind the eyes, the hush that settles over a market when too many voices are missing. History often remembers kings, battles, and monuments. Yet again and again, the deeper turning points arrive on quieter feet. A sickness crosses a harbor, follows a road, drifts through a camp, and suddenly the world people trusted no longer feels stable. This is not only a story about disease, it is a story about human certainty meeting something it cannot fully name. Across centuries, empires believed themselves ordered, protected, chosen, or enduring. Athens trusted in reason. Rome trusted in power. Medieval Europe trusted in faith and hierarchy. The great civilizations of the Americas trusted in inherited worlds shaped by memory, ritual, and land. Each seemed permanent while it lasted. Each would learn how fragile permanence can be. The plagues we remember are more than medical events. They are mirrors held up to human life at its most vulnerable. In their wake, fields went untended, prayers changed tone, rulers lost their grip, and ordinary people were forced to ask impossible questions. Why this? Why now? Why us? Sometimes science offers part of an answer. Sometimes history offers only fragments. A monk's description, a physician's notes, a mass grave, a silence where a people once stood. And that silence matters because what vanished was never only bodies. It was confidence, continuity, songs that would no longer be sung in the same voice. So we begin here, in the space between evidence and memory, tracing 10 ancient pandemics that did more than kill. They altered belief, rearranged power, and reminded every age of the same humbling truth. The forces that reshape the world are not always the ones we can see. What if the first great warnings came from a city already under siege? In the summer heat of 430 BCE, Athens was crowded beyond reason. Families from the countryside had retreated behind the city walls, carrying what they could, trusting stone and strategy to protect them from Sparta. Instead, the city became a vessel sealed too tightly, full of breath, fear, smoke, and hope. Then the illness arrived. No one knew exactly where it began. Some said it came from distant lands to the south, moving through trade routes and ports before slipping into the Piraeus, the harbor that fed Athens and tied it to the wider world. What mattered was how quickly it spread. People who had survived war found themselves facing something stranger, burning fevers, thirst that could not be satisfied, bodies failing in ways that seemed to mock logic itself. Physicians died beside their patients, temples filled, then emptied into grief. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the outbreak himself, wrote with the clarity of a man watching order unravel in real time. He described not only the symptoms, but the moral weather of the city. Customs broke down, funeral rites were abandoned or rushed, some became reckless, convinced that nothing mattered if death could arrive without pattern or justice. Others turned inward, searching for meaning in suffering that seemed random and total. Athens was the birthplace of argument, philosophy, and democratic ambition. It believed in the power of speech, law, and civic imagination. Yet plague asked a different kind of question. What becomes of reason when pain outruns explanation? What happens to democracy when trust itself begins to rot? The disease did not destroy Athens in a single blow, but it wounded the city at the level of spirit. Leadership weakened, confidence thinned. War, which had once seemed a contest of strategy, became entangled with exhaustion and mourning. The plague revealed a truth that history would repeat many times. A civilization can survive an enemy at the gates more easily than an invisible force already inside its walls. And perhaps that is why Athens still feels close to us. Its tragedy was not simply that it suffered, but that it discovered how fragile brilliance can be when the body of a city begins to fail. What if an empire's greatest strength became the road by which its illness traveled? In 165 CE, Rome seemed built to outlast time itself. Its legions crossed deserts and mountains. Its roads stitched provinces together with stone precision. Its ports gathered grain, metals, language, and law from the known world. Then soldiers returned from campaigns in the east carrying something no engineer could contain. At first, it was another rumor from the frontier, fever in the camps, Strange eruptions on the skin. Men who should have survived a march suddenly collapsing in barracks and marketplaces. But the rumor widened into pattern. From Syria to Gaul, from military outposts to crowded cities, the sickness followed movement itself. The empire that had mastered connection, now found connection, turned against it. A physician named Galen left some of the clearest descriptions: burning fever, stomach distress, lesions that darkened and crusted over. A long and punishing course for those who did not die quickly. Many historians believe it was smallpox, though certainty remains out of reach. What is clearer is the scale. Millions may have died over the years that followed. Recruitment weakened. Border defenses thinned. Tax revenues fell. In places where Rome once counted everything, it began to lose count. The crisis unfolded during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who wrote about discipline, mortality, and the necessity of accepting what lies beyond control. There is something almost unbearably human in that image. The ruler of the most powerful state in the Mediterranean, turning inward not because he had ceased to believe in duty, but because duty was no shield against grief. And that may be the deeper meaning of the Antonine Plague. It did not erase Rome in a single generation. It exposed the first long fracture in the marble. Beneath the order, the triumph, the confidence, there was always vulnerability waiting for its hour. Sometimes history changes not when a civilization loses its ambition, but when it discovers that endurance has a body and bodies can fail. What if the second blow is the one that changes everything? By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome had not yet fallen, but it no longer moved with the old assurance. Emperors rose and vanished in quick succession. Frontiers shook, grain routes strained, and into this atmosphere of instability came another epidemic, one so severe that later generations would remember it through the voice of a bishop watching the world darken around him. Cyprian, writing from Carthage, described a disease that seemed to attack the whole body at once. The bowels were emptied by relentless illness. The throat burned, eyes dimmed, limbs weakened. In cities already living with political confusion and economic stress, the outbreak felt less like an interruption than a judgment written across daily life. Though modern scholars still debate the exact disease, the social impact is less uncertain. The empire was exhausted, and plague made exhaustion visible. In some places, the dead were so numerous that burial became a civic problem before it remained a sacred one. Labor faltered. Armies struggled to replenish themselves. Villages and urban districts alike learned that crisis was no longer temporary. It had become the climate of the age. Rome had survived many dangers by projecting force and absorbing loss. But a pandemic does not negotiate with power. It works inward, hollowing the systems that once looked immovable. Yet amid the fear, another story emerged. Christian communities, still far from dominant, became known in some regions for tending the sick and burying the abandoned. This did not erase suffering, and it should not be romanticized. People were frightened everywhere. But in the memory of the epidemic, acts of care acquired a new visibility. Compassion became not only a private virtue, but a public witness. That may be why the Plague of Cyprian matters beyond its death toll. It arrived when the empire's confidence was already thinning and asked what, if anything, still held society together. Not law alone, not armies alone. Sometimes what survives a period of collapse is a smaller, quieter thing. The choice to remain human when history seems to reward only fear. And perhaps every civilization is measured, in its hardest season, by that choice. What if the end of a world did not begin with fire, but with breath? In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire still imagined itself as Rome renewed. Emperor Justinian dreamed of restoration on a grand scale, reclaiming lost Western territories, codifying law, raising monuments that seemed to turn stone into prayer. Constantinople, his capital, was a city of light on the water, crowded with merchants, sailors, priests, laborers, and officials. It was the center of a world that believed history could be gathered back into human hands. Then the ships kept arriving. They came through the grain routes from Egypt and beyond, carrying food, trade goods, and, it seems, rats and fleas that moved unseen through the machinery of empire. In 541 CE, plague appeared at the edges of the Mediterranean world. By the following year, it had entered Constantinople. Witnesses described a city overcome by swelling fevers, delirium, and sudden death. Streets changed character. Homes became sick rooms. Public life narrowed into the grim mathematics of removal, burial, and survival. The historian Procopius wrote of daily death on a scale that strained belief. Modern estimates vary, and certainty is difficult, but the impact was unmistakable. The plague did not simply pass through and vanish. It returned in waves over generations, weakening populations, disrupting tax systems, military campaigns, and agricultural rhythms. Justinian's vision of imperial recovery began to dim, not all at once, but like a lamp losing oil. And still, the human details remain the most haunting. Officials searching for places to store the dead, families trapped between duty and terror, a ruler said to have fallen ill himself, discovering that even imperial authority could not command the body to remain whole. The Justinianic Plague stands at a threshold in history. It reminds us that civilizations often imagine decline as a political event, a failed policy, a lost war, a bad ruler. But sometimes decline begins deeper down, in the interruption of ordinary life, in the breaking of continuity, in the slow erosion of confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. When a society can no longer trust the rhythm of its own survival, what disappears first? Its strength or its sense of time? What if disease did not only wound empires but arrived as a season of unmaking for the old world itself? In the centuries after Justinian, plague did not vanish. It lingered at the edges of memory and returned in intervals, moving through ports, caravans, and settlements, with a patience that history rarely gives to human beings. For communities already living close to the margin, each return changed more than a census. It altered inheritance, labor, family, and the fragile confidence that the future could be planned. In villages across the Mediterranean and Near East, the effects were often quieter than in imperial capitals, but no less profound. A field left unharvested for one season might be reclaimed. Left untended for several, it became evidence of a deeper break. Trade routes narrowed. Some towns shrank. Others disappeared into the landscape, leaving pottery, foundations, and unanswered questions for archaeologists centuries later. We often picture pandemics through dramatic episodes, yet their longest work may be done in silence. This is where history becomes more difficult to narrate. Records grow thinner, names vanish. The people most affected are often the ones least likely to leave written testimony. And still, the pattern can be sensed. Recurrent mortality wearing away at systems that depended on continuity. Children were not born into the same world their grandparents had known. The map still looked familiar, but the pulse beneath it had changed. Plague, in that sense, became part of the transition between eras. Not the only cause of transformation, never the sole explanation, but one of the pressures that reshaped the texture of life from late antiquity into the medieval world. Faith deepened in some places. Fatalism deepened in others. Communities adapted, improvised, endured. Perhaps that is the most difficult truth to sit with. History is not only made in the spectacular moment of collapse, it is also made in the long after. In the years when people rebuild with fewer hands, dimmer memories, and a quieter idea of what is possible, and maybe every age inherits not just the ruins of the past, but the altered rhythms left behind by those who survived it. What if the most remembered plague in history is also the one most difficult to fully imagine? In the mid-14th century, Europe did not know it was approaching a threshold that would divide time into before and after. The world was already strained by hunger, war, and inequality. Then, across trade routes linking Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, the Black Death began its terrible passage. It moved with ships and caravans with grain, cloth, and ordinary commerce. In 1347, it reached Mediterranean ports. From there, it spread with astonishing speed into cities and villages alike. Contemporary accounts speak of swellings in the groin and under the arms, dark marks on the skin, fevers, terror, and death that came so quickly it seemed to outrun comprehension. Families were broken within days. Priests, physicians, laborers, and nobles entered the same narrowing circle of risk. For once, social rank could not promise meaningful protection. Yet the Black Death was not only a biological event, It was a crisis of meaning. People searched for causes in the heavens, in corrupted air, in divine anger, in strangers, in themselves. Some responded with prayer, some with service, some with denial, some with cruelty. Fear sharpened old prejudices and created new wounds. Communities that should have been bound together by grief were sometimes fractured by suspicion instead. And still, life did not stop. That may be the strangest detail. Markets reopened. Children were born. Bells continued to ring over towns permanently changed. In the aftermath, labor became more valuable in many regions because there were fewer hands to work the land. Social order shifted. Old assumptions about hierarchy and scarcity were forced into negotiation with a new reality. The Black Death remains haunting not simply because so many died, but because it revealed the unstable bond between mortality and meaning. When death becomes common, does life grow smaller or more vivid? When the future no longer feels guaranteed, do people cling harder to old certainties or begin to imagine different ones? That question did not end in the 14th century. It still waits for every age that believes itself secure. What if the true aftermath of plague is not death alone, but the strange new world left behind for the living? After the Black Death tore through Europe, the silence it left was uneven. Some towns recovered quickly. Others seemed to breathe more slowly for generations. Entire households vanished. Monasteries emptied. Fields returned to weeds. Yet beneath the mourning, something deeper was shifting. The old social order had survived, but no longer with the same unquestioned authority. Labor suddenly carried a different weight. In many regions, surviving peasants and workers found that their effort was no longer as easily replaced. Wages rose in places where officials had long assumed people could be commanded rather than persuaded. Land changed hands, expectations changed with it. Attempts to force society back into its earlier shape often failed, not because power disappeared, but because scarcity had altered the balance between those who owned and those who worked. The change was psychological as much as economic. Art began to dwell more openly on death, not always with horror, but with intimacy. Skeletons entered murals and manuscripts as companions rather than abstractions. Prayer became more urgent for some, more uncertain for others. If life could be interrupted so suddenly, then every ordinary day acquired a different color. Bread, laughter, sunlight, and companionship no longer belonged entirely to routine. They had to be noticed. This was not a clean transformation. Suffering did not automatically make societies wiser. Violence, fear, and inequality endured. But plague had exposed the fiction that the world was naturally fixed in place. What had seemed permanent was negotiable. What had seemed ordained was vulnerable. Well, the result was not one single new Europe, but a continent unsettled into change. That is often how history moves. Not with one revelation, but with many quiet revisions after catastrophe. A law rewritten, a field reworked, a prayer spoken differently, a child raised in the shadow of stories that adults still struggle to tell. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the plague years. Survival does not restore the old world. It asks people to live honestly in the one that remains. What if the most devastating pandemics were not only those recorded in imperial chronicles, but those that erased voices before the world had learned their names? When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than weapons, animals, and ambition. They also carried diseases that had circulated for centuries in the Old World, illnesses that many newcomers survived with some inherited resistance, but that indigenous societies in the Americas had never encountered on such terms. The result was not one single outbreak, but a succession of epidemics that moved ahead of conquest, alongside it, and long after first contact. Smallpox is often placed at the center of this story, and with reason. Accounts from the early 16th century describe communities collapsing under fever and pustules, leaders dying at pivotal moments, and systems of tribute, kinship, and ritual breaking under sudden loss. In the Americas, disease often arrived in a landscape already destabilized by war, forced labor, displacement, and ecological upheaval. Epidemic illness was not an isolated event. It became part of a broader catastrophe. The tragedy is difficult to measure because the scale was so vast and the record so uneven. Entire towns were transformed before outsiders described them. Oral traditions carried grief where written archives were absent or later destroyed. Knowledge held in ceremony, agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and language was interrupted as elders died and communities were scattered. When people speak of vanished civilizations, this is often what they miss. Not disappearance into myth, but the violent interruption of living worlds. And yet, indigenous societies did not simply vanish. They adapted, mourned, resisted, remembered, and rebuilt under impossible pressure. That matters. To tell this history only as extinction is to repeat the blindness of conquest. The fuller truth is harder and more human. Disease magnified the injuries of empire, but survival persisted in forms colonizers neither understood nor controlled. So this chapter asks us to look carefully at what pandemic means when joined to invasion. Not a mystery, not fate alone, but a meeting of biology and power that changed the hemisphere. And perhaps the deepest loss in such moments is not only life itself, but the worlds of meaning that die when memory is forced to begin again. What if the disease that changed history most profoundly was the one that returned again and again, each time wearing a slightly different face? Smallpox did not belong to a single century or a single civilization. It moved across continents and generations with grim familiarity, leaving scars on skin and deeper marks on memory. In ancient and early modern worlds alike, it was one of humanity's most intimate adversaries, entering homes, nurseries, barracks, and courts without regard for rank. Its symptoms were unmistakable once seen. Fever rose, the body weakened. Then came the eruption, painful and visible, transforming the face into a record of survival or a prelude to burial. Those who lived often carried permanent reminders. Those who died left families with the unbearable task of remembering them in bodies altered almost beyond recognition. Few diseases have so powerfully joined mortality to identity itself. And yet smallpox also changed the way people thought. Long before modern microbiology, communities recognized patterns. Survivors seemed protected. Exposure mattered. Isolation mattered. Across Asia, Africa, and the Ottoman world, methods of deliberate inoculation emerged from observation and inherited practice. They were imperfect and risky, but they represented something essential in human history: the refusal to remain passive before suffering. Knowledge did not begin in laboratories alone. It also began in households, villages, and traditions willing to learn from pain. When these practices later traveled and evolved, they prepared the ground for vaccination, one of the most consequential medical transformations ever achieved. That does not erase the centuries of loss that came before, but it does reveal a different thread running through pandemic history. Alongside death, there is also memory. Alongside fear, experiment. Alongside devastation, the stubborn human instinct to study what harms us and turn that knowledge toward protection. Smallpox, therefore, occupies a strange place in the story of civilization. It is both ancient terror and the catalyst for one of medicine's greatest hopes. It reminds us that humanity's encounter with disease is not only a chronicle of vulnerability, but also a record of attention, adaptation, and care. Perhaps that is one of history's quietest miracles, that from repeated sorrow, people sometimes learn how to keep one another alive. What if the real history of pandemics is not a series of isolated disasters, but a long conversation between human movement and the unseen world? When we step back from individual outbreaks, a pattern begins to emerge. Disease follows roads, ships, trade, armies, pilgrimages, harvest cycles, and ambition. The very systems that allow civilizations to flourish also create new pathways of vulnerability. Connection makes culture possible. It also makes contagion possible. This is one of history's hardest lessons because it resists simple moral meaning. Trade is not evil. Cities are not mistakes. Curiosity, exploration, exchange, and expansion are deeply human impulses, and they have given rise to art, science, law, and shared memory. Yet every widening horizon carries risk. The more closely a world is woven together, the more quickly a local crisis can become a civilizational one. Ancient people understood pieces of this without having our scientific vocabulary. They noticed that ports were dangerous in certain seasons, that armies became sick after long campaigns, That crowded places amplified suffering, that some illnesses returned while others seemed to come from elsewhere, like weather from an unfamiliar sea. Their explanations differed from ours, but their observations were often sharp. They lived inside uncertainty and still tried to map it. And perhaps that is why the study of old pandemics remains so moving. It reminds us that knowledge is always incomplete at first. People must act before they fully understand. They must comfort one another before certainty arrives. They must make ethical choices in the fog. Civilizations often imagine themselves as masters of complexity. Pandemic history offers a humbler image. We are participants in a living world whose networks sustain us and expose us at the same time. The roads that bring food also bring fever. The harbor that enriches a city may also transform it forever. So the question is not whether humanity can withdraw from connection. It cannot. The deeper question is whether we can build forms of connection wise enough to remember their cost. What if the most enduring legacy of plague is the way it changes how people see one another? In every ancient pandemic, beyond the numbers and the chronicles, there is a quieter drama unfolding at the level of the human face. A neighbor becomes a risk. A stranger becomes a source of fear. A healer becomes both hope and witness. Disease rearranges proximity. It forces societies to renegotiate the meaning of touch, duty, distance, and care. Some respond by narrowing the circle of concern. They retreat into suspicion, searching for someone to blame, someone to separate, someone to name as the carrier of disorder. Others move in the opposite direction. They discover, sometimes against instinct, that compassion is not the denial of danger, but the decision to remain morally present within it. The sick still need water. The dead still need dignity. The frightened still need language gentle enough to keep panic from becoming cruelty. This tension appears again and again across history. In Athens, in Rome, in medieval towns, in colonized lands facing epidemics alongside conquest, the same question returns in different forms. When suffering becomes widespread, do people become less human to one another or more? There has never been a universal answer. Every age contains both impulses. But that is precisely why these stories matter. They reveal character under pressure. Pandemics also humble the illusion of separateness. No civilization, however sophisticated, has ever been fully sealed. The weak and the powerful breathe the same air. The choices of merchants, rulers, soldiers, and travelers enter the bodies of ordinary people. Illness makes visible a truth that daily life often allows us to ignore. Human beings live in radical interdependence, bound not only by economy or law, but by exposure, vulnerability, and shared consequence. Perhaps that is why the memory of plague can feel strangely intimate across centuries. We do not only study the dead, we recognize ourselves in the choices they faced. And in that recognition lies a difficult hope, that the measure of a society is not whether it escapes vulnerability, but how it learns to carry one another through it. What if the oldest pandemics are still teaching us how to think about the future? When archaeologists uncover burial pits, when historians compare fragments of testimony, when scientists recover traces of ancient pathogens from teeth and bone, they are doing more than reconstructing disaster. They are listening for patterns in the long memory of the human species. Not to prove that history repeats in exact form, because it never does, but to understand the recurring meeting point between biology, environment, and human behavior. The lesson is not simply that disease is inevitable. It is that vulnerability is woven into progress itself. The growth of cities, the expansion of trade, the movement of armies, the crossing of oceans, the domestication of animals, the clearing of forests, the changing climate of a region, all of these can reshape the conditions in which illness emerges and spreads. Human ingenuity expands possibility. It also creates new ecological conversations, some of which we only recognize when they turn dangerous. And yet the study of ancient pandemics is not an exercise in fatalism. It is, in a quieter way, a study of preparedness in the broadest sense. Not only medicine, but memory. Not only treatment, but imagination. Civilizations suffer most when they believe themselves exempt from limits. They endure more wisely when they remember that resilience is cultural as much as scientific. It lives in trust, in institutions, in good records, in honest public language, in respect for evidence, and in the moral courage to care for those most exposed. The dead of earlier plagues leave us no direct instructions. What they leave instead is perspective. They remind us that crisis always feels unprecedented from the inside, even when it belongs to an old human pattern. They remind us that uncertainty is not failure, and that humility can be a form of strength. Perhaps the future will never be secured by confidence alone. Perhaps it will be shaped by something steadier. The willingness to learn from buried worlds before we become one ourselves. So where does this journey leave us? Not at the end of history, and not with a single moral neatly tied in place. The pandemics that devastated ancient civilizations do not form a simple tale of punishment or progress. They reveal something older and more difficult, that human life has always unfolded in negotiation with forces larger than any city, empire, or belief system can fully contain. Across Athens, Rome, Byzantium, medieval Europe, and the indigenous worlds of the Americas, disease became more than an episode of suffering. It became a test of meaning. Each outbreak exposed the hidden architecture of a civilization, what it trusted, what it feared, who it protected, what it was willing to sacrifice, and how it explained loss when explanation itself began to fail. In that way, pandemics have always been historical mirrors. They show societies to themselves, often more honestly than triumph ever can, but they also show us something gentler. Again and again, amid collapse, people cared for one another. They observed, adapted, buried the dead, protected the young, preserved memory, and searched for knowledge even when knowledge was incomplete. That thread matters as much as the devastation. It reminds us that the history of disease is not only a record of mortality. It is also a record of endurance shaped by tenderness, attention, and the stubborn refusal to let fear have the final word. Perhaps that is why these ancient plagues continue to hold us. They speak to a permanent feature of the human condition. We build as though permanence were possible, yet live in bodies that know otherwise. We inherit worlds we did not make, try to understand them, and pass them on altered by what we have suffered and learned. In the end, the deepest question may not be how civilizations die, but how memory survives them. What do we carry forward from the broken places? Fear, certainly. Caution, yes. But maybe something else as well. A clearer sense that truth is fragile, life is shared, and the future depends on how carefully we remember the lives that came before our own.